I'll never forget the sound the envelope made when I opened it. Paper shouldn't sound cold, but this one did. It was from a law office I didn't recognize, and the minute I unfolded those pages, the room felt a degree quieter. They were trying to remove me from the family trust. My daughter, my son-in-law, the two people I kept telling myself were just busy or stressed. Turns out they were busy all right, just not in the way I wanted to believe. Before we go any further, pull up a chair. This isn't one of those stories you rush through. Stick around and I'll tell it the way it deserves to be told. I remember that morning like it's pressed in amber. The smell of coffee, burnt a little on the edges, the feel of the newspaper ink still fresh on my fingertips, and the hush of the house, the kind of quiet that almost warns you something's heading your way. My phone buzzed once, then again, my daughter's name. I didn't pick up, not out of anger, just instinct. When you've lived 68 years, you learn to trust the tremor behind a situation more than the situation itself. You feel it in your bones before you understand it with your mind. But this betrayal didn't start with a letter. It started weeks earlier, with small things I brushed off. My daughter talking to her husband in low tones whenever I walked into the room. Papers quickly tucked away. Questions she never used to ask. How was my health? Was I traveling anywhere soon? Did I still keep the old documents in the top drawer? All harmless on the surface. But I've seen enough storms begin with a single change in the wind. One night I found them sitting at my dining table whispering with the kind of intensity you see when people are planning something they're not proud of. The light above them flickered a bit, casting shadows on their faces that made them look older, worn, almost strangers. When they noticed me, they jumped like they'd heard a gunshot. My son-in-law gave me a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. He asked me if I needed anything. I said no, and walked back to my room with the uneasy feeling that I'd just stepped into the wrong chapter of my own life. The day after that came the envelope. Legal language, signatures, a quiet attempt to rearrange the future without my awareness, without my blessing, without my dignity. But here's the thing. When I read the documents, I didn't get angry. Not yet. What I felt was curiosity. Because if they were doing this for money, they would have faced me head on. But they were hiding, whispering, nervous. That kind of behavior comes from fear, not greed. And fear always has a source. I didn't know the full truth yet. But I knew one thing. I'd seen that same nervous tremor years ago, on a fishing trip neither of them knew I remembered. And somewhere in this house was the piece of paper that connected everything. The past has a strange way of waiting for you. He muttered something about financial stability, future planning, protecting the family. I listened, and under each word, I heard something rattling inside him. Something connected to that fishing trip all those years ago. When the conversation fizzled out and they finally left, my daughter hugged me. It was a fragile thing, like she was hugging me goodbye without saying the words. Her husband shook my hand. His palm was cold and damp. When the door closed behind them, I went straight to the hallway closet. The one with the old cardboard boxes no one touches anymore. I pulled down the box labeled odds and ends, the kind of box where you throw things you can't bring yourself to toss but don't want to deal with. Inside was a tangle of memories. A broken watch, a baseball card, a postcard from a motel I barely remembered staying at, and at the very bottom, curled slightly at the edges, was the fishing license. His name on it, the wrong name, the name he'd sworn no one would ever see again. I held that little piece of paper between my fingers and felt the weight of everything click into place, like a bone finally snapping back into its socket. So this wasn't just about money. This was about identity, and the truth he'd spent years running from had finally caught up. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from anger, though that would have been easier. Anger burns fast and bright. What I felt was heavier, slower, like a tide pulling at me from somewhere deep in the dark. I lay there in the quiet, listening to the old house breathe, replaying memories I hadn't touched in years. That fishing trip. His nervous laugh. His slip of a name he swore was a joke. And now this wrinkled license confirming it wasn't a joke at all. Morning came in soft gray light. The kind that makes everything look a little more honest, whether you're ready for it or not. I took the license to the kitchen, set it on the table, and stared at it while the kettle hissed. Even after all these years, the paper still held a faint smell of river water and sun-dried weeds. Funny how a scent can pull you straight back to a moment you thought you'd buried. I remembered that day clearer than I expected. The river had been calm, moving slow like syrup. He wasn't my son-in-law back then, just the young man my daughter brought home with 2 wide smiles and 2 eager hands. I didn't know him well, but I knew enough to see he was hiding something. There's a stiffness people get when they're trying too hard to look relaxed. He had that stiffness, the kind that doesn't come from shyness but from fear of being recognized. Halfway through the afternoon, a ranger came by checking licenses. The boy panicked, dropped his fishing rod into the water, fumbled for his wallet, and when he handed over his ID, he whispered the wrong name before correcting himself. I didn't say anything then, but I remembered. And now that same wrong name was staring back at me from this faded card. I turned the license over, running my thumb across the creases. People always think the big lies are the ones that do the damage, but I've learned it's the small ones, the ones whispered in the shadows, that eventually rot the whole foundation. I knew I needed answers, but I didn't want to go in guns blazing. That's a young man's mistake. At 68, you understand the value of silence, of giving someone just enough rope to reveal what they're truly hanging on to. So I called my lawyer, a calm woman with the patience of a mountain. I told her what I'd found without telling her why it mattered yet. She asked me if I wanted to pursue legal action. I told her not yet. I wanted to hear the truth from the source before I decided how to swing the hammer. After breakfast, I drove out to the lake where that old trip had happened. Not because I was nostalgic, because I needed to see the place again, needed to feel that same air on my face to remind myself who I was back then and who I still could be. The road out there was cracked and sun-bleached, the kind of road that never gets repaired because no one complains enough to justify the cost. When I stepped out of the truck, the wind carried the smell of algae and wet earth, a familiar, lonely scent. The water looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I'd just grown bigger in the ways life forces you to grow. I sat on a worn-out bench and thought about my daughter, how she used to run toward me when she was little, arms wide, her laugh loud enough to echo off the hills. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped running toward me and started running behind him. Love can do that. Shift gravity without warning. Maybe she didn't know what he was hiding. Maybe she did. Both possibilities hurt. On my way home, I passed by the small tackle shop near the main road, the same one we'd visited on that trip. I pulled in on instinct. The place smelled the same. Old bait, rubber waders, and the metallic tang of fishing hooks. The man behind the counter looked older, but his eyes were still sharp. I asked him if he remembered that summer, the one with the ranger checks. He laughed, said they'd caught a couple of people fishing under borrowed names. One of them, a young guy with shaky hands. My heart thumped once, hard. I asked if he recalled the name the guy used. The man thought for a moment, tapping his fingers on the counter. Then he said it. The wrong name. The name on the license. That was all the confirmation I needed. By the time I got back home, the sun was dipping low, turning the sky into a bruised mix of purple and gold. I went to my study and pulled out an old photo album, the one my daughter used to flip through when she wanted to feel safe. I turned the pages slowly, touching the glossy images, the handwritten notes on the corners. I stopped on a photo from the fishing trip. Not of him. He'd ducked out of every picture, but of my daughter sitting on the pier, grinning at me with a sunburned nose. That was the memory they were risking for a secret he was too afraid to face. I heard a car pull up outside, gravel crunching under slow, deliberate tires. I peeked through the curtain. It was him, alone. He stepped out of the car like every movement hurt, shoulders slouched, eyes darting. A man walking into a truth he couldn't outrun anymore. I opened the door before he could knock. He flinched. I didn't say a word, just stepped aside and let him enter. He walked in like it wasn't my home anymore, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch the air around him. We sat in the living room. The room felt colder than usual, even though the heater hummed in the corner. He kept rubbing his palms on his pants, trying to dry the sweat. When I placed the fishing license on the coffee table between us, he sucked in a breath so sharp it sounded like a wound opening. He didn't deny it, didn't pretend it wasn't his. His shoulders sagged, and his face, always so composed, crumbled at the edges. His voice was small when he finally spoke, almost childlike. I knew this would come back one day. I didn't respond. I let the silence do its work. He started talking then, words pouring out like a confession he'd held too long. He told me the name he used back then wasn't fake. It was real. His real name before he changed it. Before he ran from a past he'd never wanted my daughter to know. A past tied to debts, to mistakes, to people he feared would find him again if his real identity surfaced. The trust paperwork wasn't about greed. It was about him trying to secure something without leaving a trail. He wasn't trying to cut me out. He was trying to protect himself. There it was, the truth. Ugly, fragile, human. And now I had to decide what kind of man I was going to be with it. He sat there in my living room, hunched forward like a man waiting for a sentence he already knew was coming. The confession hung between us, heavy as wet wool. I could hear the heater clicking, struggling to keep the cold at bay. But somehow the room still felt colder than before. Maybe it was the truth settling in. Truth has a way of drawing the warmth out of a place. He told me his old name again, slower this time, like a person returning to a language he hadn't spoken in years. I watched his eyes as he said it. They didn't hold defiance. They held exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who's been walking with a shadow on his back so long he doesn't remember what it's like to stand straight. When he finished speaking, he leaned back as if the words had physically lifted off him. He wasn't crying, but he looked like he'd been holding back tears for a lifetime. I didn't move. I just studied him. You learn a lot about a person when you shut up long enough to let them reveal themselves. So, I finally said, my voice quieter than I expected. You thought cutting me out would keep your past buried. He closed his eyes like the word stung. I thought, if there were fewer names tied to the trust, fewer records, fewer ways for things to trace back to me, then maybe you'd stay invisible, I finished for him. He nodded, barely. A gesture so small it could have been mistaken for a twitch. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows. It sounded like the house itself was sighing. I sat back and let the memory of that fishing trip wash over me again. The panicked look he'd worn, the trembling hands. Back then, I figured it was nerves of a young man trying to impress his girlfriend's father. Funny how clarity comes knocking years late, holding a faded piece of paper. What did my daughter know? I asked. His jaw tightened. Not everything. The hesitation told me what I needed to know. She knew enough to help him hide, enough to betray me in the process. It wasn't the crime that hit hardest. It was the trust. Mine, not the legal one. The trust between father and daughter. I felt something in my chest slide out of place, painfully and permanently. She thought it was to protect our future, he added, voice trembling. She didn't know the details, just that people from my past could still be watching. And if anything connected back to me. He didn't need to finish. Fear leaves fingerprints, and they were all over him. I walked to the window, steady but slow, like each step carried a separate memory I hadn't processed yet. The sky had turned the color of old bruises. I watched the branches sway, thin and fragile, and thought about how family can be like that. One strong wind, and you learn which ones bend and which ones snap. When I turned back, he was staring at the floor. "You should have come to me," I said. He shook his head. "I was afraid you'd tell her everything, and once she knew the full truth, she'd leave me." He said it so quietly it almost didn't reach me. That, right there, was the real root of it all. Not greed, not control. Fear of being abandoned, fear of being exposed. Fear strong enough to make him cut corners until he cut me out entirely. I'd seen that kind of fear before. In men at bars talking too loudly. In coworkers who lied their way into promotions they couldn't handle. In neighbors who hid bills under carpets instead of facing them. Fear makes people do cowardly things, but it also reveals what they value most. "You thought losing her was worse than losing your integrity," I said. He didn't argue. A long silence followed. Not the tense kind, but the kind where the truth slowly settles into its final place. I felt older in that moment, older than 68. I felt like every mistake I'd ever made, every lesson I'd ever learned, was sitting beside me on that couch. Then he looked up at me, eyes shining, but not quite breaking. "I'll fix it," he said. "All of it. I'll restore the trust. I'll tell her the truth if you want me to. I'll sign whatever you need. Just don't take her away from me. Don't make her hate me." I wasn't expecting that. The vulnerability, the pleading. The man in front of me wasn't some calculating villain. He was a flawed human being hanging on by threads that were starting to fray. It softened something inside me I didn't want softened. I sat back down and folded my hands. The fishing license lay between us like a tiny, fragile battlefield. "I'm not here to destroy you," I said, "but I won't let you destroy my trust in her again. You both crossed a line, and lines like that don't disappear just because someone cries over them." He nodded, accepting the blow. "You're going to fix the legal mess," I continued, "and you're going to tell her the truth. Not because I asked you to, because you owe her more than a life built on a lie." He swallowed hard. "I will. And after that," I added, "she decides what happens next. Not you, not me." He closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked like a man preparing for a storm. I stood and picked up the fishing license, held it in my hand one last time. Funny how such a small piece of paper could change the entire shape of a family. "This," I said, holding it toward him, "should have been dealt with years ago. But you hid from it, and hiding always costs more in the end." He didn't reach for it. Instead, he whispered, "Do you hate me?" I thought about my answer carefully. At my age, words carry weight, and lies are too heavy to carry this late in life. "No," I said, "I don't hate you, but I don't trust you. And trust is harder to rebuild than a name." His eyes glistened, not from self-pity, but from understanding. We stood there in the middle of the living room. Two men who loved the same woman in different ways, both damaged by fear in different shapes. Before he left, he looked back at me. "Thank you," he said, voice barely a thread. "For what?" "For giving me a chance to fix it." The door closed behind him with a soft click. I stood there staring at the wood grain, feeling the weight of the whole day press down on me. The truth was out, but now came the part no one prepares you for. Living with it. I woke up that morning with a kind of tiredness that doesn't come from lack of sleep. It comes from carrying too many truths at once, the kind that settle into your bones. My daughter hadn't spoken to me since the night I revealed everything, and my son-in-law. Well, he'd been quiet in a way only a guilty man can be quiet. I'd given them both space because sometimes space is the only thing that lets people hear themselves think. But that morning, something in the air felt different. The house was too still, even for an old place like mine. I made myself a cup of coffee, and when I turned around, the two of them were standing there in my kitchen doorway. No announcement, no warning. Just the two faces I loved most and feared losing forever. My daughter looked smaller than I remembered. My son-in-law looked like he'd slept on guilt instead of a pillow. She sat first. He stayed standing, like the chair wouldn't forgive him for what he'd tried to do. I didn't say a word. I just let the silence work on them the way life has always worked on me. Slow, heavy, honest. My daughter finally exhaled, and it sounded like a decade of hurt coming out in one breath. She told me she'd been replaying everything in her mind, the trust, the meetings behind my back, the decision they tried to take without me, and the fear behind all of it. That fear she never once admitted until this moment. The fear that when I died, she'd be left fighting her own husband for control of the family, and she didn't want to be outnumbered. She said she didn't know how to tell me she was scared of life without me in it. And I'll tell you something. There's no training in this world for hearing your own child admit she'd been planning a future shaped entirely by your disappearance. She cried, not loud, not dramatic, just that quiet kind of heartbreak that hits harder than any scream. My hand found hers on the table. It fit the same way it did when she was 5 years old and I walked her across busy parking lots. Some things don't change, even when everything else does. Then my son-in-law finally sat down. I watched his hands tremble. This man, who moved through life like it owed him an apology, looked like a boy who'd been caught stealing a compass from the very person he needed direction from. He told me he panicked. He admitted the fishing license wasn't just a slip-up. He said he'd been trying to recreate those early years with me, back before he let ambition eat through him. Said the old fishing trips were the last time he felt like a better version of himself. He said he didn't recognize the man he'd become. And I believed him. Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because guilt that raw doesn't survive long if it isn't real. Still, I didn't rush to absolve him. A father's forgiveness isn't a coupon you hand out because someone suddenly feels bad. It's a door, and doors deserve hinges sturdy enough to hold the weight of truth. So I told him the truth as I saw it, that trust isn't a document you sign, it's the space between actions, and he had burned that space down to the nails. He nodded like a man who needed the hit. We talked for an hour, maybe more. The light shifted along the counter, moving across the scratches and dents from years of living. I told them both I wasn't going anywhere, not until I took my last breath. And I wasn't about to let fear, anyone's fear, shape the future of our family. My daughter leaned into my shoulder the way she used to after nightmares. My son-in-law didn't touch me, but he looked at me with something I'd never seen in him before. Not respect, not regret. Something deeper. Maybe recognition. Maybe understanding that he'd almost thrown away the man who'd been rooting for him from the day he walked through my front door. We made no dramatic promises, no sweeping speeches, just quiet agreements spoken between breaths. He would step back from the trust until he earned his place again. She would check in more often instead of assuming silence meant strength. And I would allow myself to be human in front of them, scared, tired, alive. That night, after they left, I walked out to the shed behind the house. The place smelled like old rope, cedar, and a lifetime of stubbornness. I pulled out my tackle box, the one I hadn't touched in years, and when I opened it, the same old fishing license was sitting right where I'd left it, a little faded, a little curled at the corners, but holding strong. It reminded me of something I tend to forget. Love isn't maintained by big gestures. It's maintained by showing up, again and again, even when the water is cold and the fish aren't biting. I sat on the porch as the sun dropped behind the trees. The kind of sunset that doesn't ask to be admired. It just goes about its business and trusts you'll catch it if you look up at the right moment. I thought about family, how it breaks, how it heals, how it surprises you with both. And I realized something I wish I'd learned earlier. We spend too much time trying to protect our families from pain, when sometimes the only way to keep a family together is to walk straight through it. Here's what I want to leave you with tonight. If someone you love betrays you, don't let pride be the thing that finishes the job. Don't let silence do the real damage. Look them in the eye. Tell the truth you've been avoiding. Let them tell theirs. And if there's a chance to rebuild, just a chance, take it. Life's too short to waste on barricades. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Stick around, because the next story, well, it taught me that forgiveness is one thing, but trusting someone again, that's a whole different storm. And I'll tell you all about it soon enough.
Grandpa Harry loves you.